This is Corporate Warrior, high-intensity training lifestyle and business with Lawrence Neal, helping you improve your health and physique, become a great personal trainer, and start and grow your HIIT business.
This episode is brought to you by ARX, the most innovative, efficient, and effective all-in-one exercise machines I have ever seen. I was really impressed with my ARX workout. The intensity and adaptive resistance was unlike anything I've ever experienced. I love how the machine enables you to increase the negative load to fatigue target muscles more quickly, and I love how the workouts are effortlessly quantified. The software tracks maximum force output, rate of work, total amount of work done, and more in front of you on screen, allowing you to compete with your previous performance to give you and your clients real-time motivation. The ARX uses a computer-controlled motor to give you the exact amount of resistance your clients need 100% of the time. This means that the resistance can never become dangerous, is intuitive and simple to use, and can provide you with all of the results you and your clients are looking for in a fraction of the time. ARX is highly effective and efficient in delivering all of the benefits of exercise, including increased strength, muscle mass, cardiovascular conditioning, bone mineral density, and injury recovery. As well as being utilized by many high-intensity trainers to deliver highly effective and efficient workouts to their clients, ARX comes highly recommended by world-class trainers and brands, including Bulletproof, Tony Robbins, and Ben Greenfield Fitness. To find out more about ARX and get $500 off install when you place an order, please go to arxfit.com and mention Corporate Warrior in the How Did You Hear About Us field. So again, to get $500 off install when you order, head on over to arxfit.com and enter Corporate Warrior in the How Did You Hear About Us field. Lawrence Neal here, and welcome back to corporatewarrior.co. Today's guest is Dr. Martin Gibala. Martin Gibala is a professor and chair of the Department of Kinesiology at McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada. His research on the health benefits of interval training has attracted immense scientific attention and worldwide media coverage. He is the author of a best-selling book, The 1 Minute Workout. Science shows a way to get fit that's smarter, faster, shorter. Martin has published more than 100 peer-reviewed articles, is frequently invited to speak at international scientific meetings, and has received multiple awards for teaching excellence. This is episode 191, and Martin, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me on again.
You're welcome. And I just realized I probably didn't need to read out episode 191, although I suppose if the listeners are listening to this from their podcast apps, they know to search 191 on the blog, which is the point of that. So as we were kind of discussing before we got started, I've got a whole list of stuff I want to ask you. I'm sure we'll probably only cover a third because then I'll end up coming at you with random kind of improvised follow-up questions. But that's absolutely fine because I like to go deep on these subjects. So last time we spoke, I listened to our last podcast a couple of times. And we talked a lot about VO2 max. And you mentioned that a higher VO2 max is associated with lower risk of all-cause mortality and chronic disease and better health. And I just wondered, is there, when it comes to VO2 max, is it that we should be trying to optimize it so that it's as high as it can possibly be for the individual? Is that important for lowering the risk of these things? Or is there a threshold where going beyond that, there really isn't much in the way of improved returns for health span?
Yeah, I'd say there's more a point of diminishing returns. So you get a lot of your bang for your buck early on. And so just moving out of, for example, the lowest fitness level or the complete sedentary behavior, if you can move into the next quartile even, or boost your fitness by a small amount, there's a lot of return in terms of the lowering of the risk of developing cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. You continue to accrue benefits the higher your VO2 max, but the relative reduction in risk is not the same. It's smaller. So it's not a straight line, if you will. It's a curvilinear relationship. So you get a lot of bang for your buck early, diminishing returns after that.
Cool. Thank you. And what, because I'm just curious, I understand a very basic level, that VO2 max is maximal oxygen uptake. But is there, do we understand like the mechanisms behind why increasing that is associated with these improvements that I mentioned earlier? Do we understand some of the mechanisms as to why that is yet?
Yeah, I think we understand that quite well. Broadly speaking, what determines VO2 max, or the maximal rate of oxygen uptake by the body, is the ability of the heart, the lungs, the blood vessels to circulate oxygen through the body, and the ability of the tissues, primarily skeletal muscle, to take up and use that oxygen. So there's an oxygen delivery standpoint and there's an oxygen utilization aspect. Most people would accept that the primary determinant of VO2 max, or the thing that largely influences VO2 max in most people, is oxygen delivery. And that's primarily owing to the capacity of the heart to pump blood. And so the overall health of the cardiovascular system, and in particular, the overall health and function of the heart, is what largely determines VO2 max. And those are the same issues that can impact then on overall health.
Okay, cool. So is it that you think that high intensity interval training and similar modalities might be improving heart health, so centrally improving the heart? I mean, I know there's some research to show that. Is it that the left ventricle of the heart hypertrophies from this type of training? Do you want to talk a little bit about what we know in terms of how it benefits the heart directly?
Yeah, so we know a lot from traditional endurance exercise in terms of how the heart literally remodels. And as you alluded to, part of the reason why the heart becomes a better, stronger pump is the heart enlarges. And so the size of the left ventricle gets bigger. And so that means with any given heart contraction, that more blood can be pumped with each beat. So the heart literally gets bigger, the left ventricle gets larger. That allows more blood to go into the ventricle and subsequently be pumped out. Also, the heart itself, so the intrinsic pumping capacity of the heart, gets a little bit better as well. And so I think that's generally well accepted for why cardiac output, or a maximal amount of blood coming out of the heart each minute, improves after endurance exercise. One would think that it's largely the same type of remodeling that happens with high intensity interval exercise, although that's really an active area of research. And we know that interval training can be very effective for boosting VO2 max, but in terms of the physiological reasons for why that happens, it's certainly less clear than traditional endurance exercise. And so one aspect of our current research is trying to look at cardiac output and get a sense of does the reason that the heart improves as a result of traditional endurance exercise, is it the same with high intensity interval exercise? And right now, I think you could point to some research, some limited research, saying that yes, the stroke volume goes up and cardiac output goes up, but there's also a line of research that would suggest it's more related to the ability of the muscles to take up and utilize the oxygen. So the extraction of oxygen by muscles improves. And so bottom line is, I think there's a line of thought that the physiological remodeling should be very similar, but it remains a very open area of investigation right now. And we don't know, is the bottom line, the mechanisms fully for the improvement in VO2 max after interval exercise training, particularly the very short, very high intensity sprint type interval training.
Because the study that I remember being cited in Body by Science from Doug McGuff in relation to your work, where you compared some form, forgive me, I can't remember the exact mode, whether it was high intensity interval training or sprint interval training versus steady state. And I believe the part of the conclusion said that, what was effectively 6 minutes of high intensity interval training equated, the outcomes were the same when compared to something like 6 hours of steady state. Now, do you remember what those outcomes were? Because I'm assuming based on what you just said there, that the outcomes that you were measuring for weren't things like left ventricle hypertrophy. They were more related to VO2 max or something else, or enzymes perhaps.
Correct. We've done a few comparative studies, but our most robust, if you will, involved a 12-week or 3-month comparison of groups of individuals who either did traditional endurance exercise, and so that was 2.5 hours a week of steady state cardio, so 3 50-minute sessions of steady state cardio exercise. And the other group was a sprint interval training group. They were doing 3 20-second all-out bursts of cycling set within about a 10-minute time commitment. So it took 10 minutes in the one group. It took 50 minutes in the other group. And the 10-minute sprint group was really only doing 1 minute, 3 20-second very hard efforts. Both groups trained 3 times a week for 12 weeks. The primary outcomes were VO2 max, so whole body oxygen uptake. And the mean improvement, or the average improvement, was the same in the two groups. It was 19% after 12 weeks of training. Obviously, there was some variability, or the range of responses was not everyone increased by the same amount. The other two primary outcomes were we took muscle biopsies to look at mitochondrial content. So that's a marker of skeletal muscle's ability to use oxygen. And we also measured something called insulin sensitivity. So that reflects the body's ability to clear glucose. And we used a fairly robust technique to look at that. So those were the primary outcomes. We can conclude from that study that on average, 3 months of interval training, very short, hard interval training, can improve VO2 max to a similar extent as traditional endurance exercise, as reflected in the public health guidelines. But we don't know from that study what was the precise mechanisms for the improvement in VO2 max. And so one of the studies that we're currently about to embark on is going to be a 12-week interval training study using that same protocol, but we're going to be using a device that allows us to try and estimate cardiac output. So try and look at the mechanisms for why VO2 max improved with these short sprint interval training protocols.
Do you suspect that the benefits, the outcomes from high intensity interval training, in terms of those that we don't know, so the overall kind of health benefits are going to be equal to steady state exercise?
And this is where I don't want to hedge, but I think the reality is it's going to depend, and it's largely going to depend on the person. So there's huge inter-individual variability in responses. And so I think if we were to take 100 or 1,000 people and look at average responses to the two types of training, I think there's increasing evidence that the average responses that you can see can be surprisingly similar, but not all of the responses are going to increase in the same manner for all individuals. And I think this is, for me, this is what speaks to the need for a varied approach to training. I'll often use the stock market analogy as, you can bet on a single stock and you might hit a home run with it, but it might go bust as well. And so, the old adage for, don't put all your eggs in one basket, spreading around your investments, and that you're likely to get decent returns with lower risk. For me, there are parallels there when it comes to exercise training. And again, I think this is why it speaks to a varied approach to fitness, generally speaking, being best for most individuals. Now, we can get into the details of if people are very time pressed, or they particularly prefer one type of training, or they're looking to really optimize one marker, whether it's blood pressure or cardiorespiratory fitness or something else. That's where all the devil's in the detail, and you really got to know how you're going to respond to a type of training, and importantly, what you prefer.
Yeah, I think just to simplify things on this podcast, I think it's best if we think about everything from a health span perspective, because obviously as soon as we start nudging towards optimizing cardiorespiratory fitness, then there's a trade-off, right? And so that's going to make it very difficult for you to answer, I think, some of my questions.
Sure.
But no, that's really interesting. Do you think, I'm just trying to think about, what you said there, is that kind of why you believe that a optimal approach with regard to, again, optimizing health span is really, use, because we don't know all the answers, is implementing some resistance training as well as, some kind of high intensity interval training on a regular basis.
Well, let's start with an elite endurance athlete, right? So if we want to talk about who has the highest VO2 max values out there, it's elite endurance athletes, and cross-country skiers would be the extreme example. And so if you look at how those individuals train, you could make the case that that's the best way to improve cardiorespiratory fitness or VO2 max in individuals who obviously have some genetic predisposition to do that. Those individuals are going to use a varied approach. They're probably not going to do more than about 20% of their total training volume as high intensity intervals. Now they're training 40 hours a week. If you're only training 15 or 10 hours a week, it might be quite different. And those individuals, the vast majority are incorporating resistance exercise training as well to help support their overall approach to training. So, it doesn't mean that everyone has to train like elite endurance athletes, in part because the time available. And so I think while the 80-20% mix of traditional cardio to high intensity intervals works if you're an elite endurance athlete training 40 hours a week, if you're a regular person who has family commitments and a job and you're particularly time pressed, I think that ratio can change dramatically. And I would make the case that incorporating much more intervals is a more time efficient strategy in order to achieve that. And of course, resistance exercise training is important to include in that as well.
Yeah, I was going to come on to kind of optimal regime later, but it makes sense to probably touch on that now, considering we're talking about it. Last time we spoke, you touched on this a little bit in terms of your own training. And I would just be curious, if you're looking at, I guess, it would be interesting to look at this from the context of my typical listener, who is someone who does high intensity strength training already. They are, family person. They have a busy job. So what they're looking from exercise is really how to optimize health span. I'd say my audience skews slightly older. So I think the pursuit of maximal muscle hypertrophy is probably not as important for them these days. So I just love to hear, maybe it's evolved since we last spoke. If you had to give someone a template with that context in mind, what would it look like in terms of overall exercise?
Yeah, I think so. It sounds like those individuals are obviously already interested in the time efficiency of interval exercise training. I would still add, and so if that type of individual, if first of all, they prefer, which it sounds like generally speaking they do, prefer an interval-based approach. I think they could sustain largely an interval-based approach or an almost exclusive interval-based approach to fitness. I would still advocate, though, for the quote-unquote cardio-style interval training as being an important element within their overall approach to fitness. Now, whether that's on a bike, whether it's on a rowing erg, whether it's hill running, whether it's stair climbing, I would still advocate for some sessions like that. I suspect we may get to this point in the conversation. I don't think you're going to get all of the health benefits by exclusively performing resistance-based exercise. So interval-based exercise, but in a resistance manner. In order to optimize outcomes. So, like I said, you could still do high intensity resistance exercise primarily, but I'd still advocate for incorporating some, again, for lack of a better term, traditional cardio style exercises within the overall training program.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, obviously, probably a good time then to come on to some of that controversy, if you want to call it that. Or it's probably more controversial to say that right now that resistance training improves cardiorespiratory fitness. even though we know it does to an extent. So I've sent you over a bunch of studies. I found a couple other, some more research that people have sent me. One was a systematic review from, I think it was Fisher and Steele and Doug McGuff, on how resistance training to failure improves cardiovascular fitness in humans, and a review of acute physiological responses and chronic physiological adaptations. And they concluded from that the overall kind of conclusion from all the research was that resistance training was effective enough to improve that. And there's two other studies I've seen as well, and one was from Takashi Abe, if I'm saying his name correctly, and Jeremy Lowenecki, and they looked at, again, a resistance training induced increase in VO2 max in young and older subjects. So there seems to be more research out there now. And, having listened to our previous podcast together and read some of this, I'm not yet entirely convinced that we need to do high intensity interval training if we're doing high intensity strength training. Now, before I actually finally ask you a question, I know I'm talking for ages here, Martin, I'm just curious, have you personally done high intensity strength training, just like, let's say, Doug McGuff would describe it? Because I know you have slightly different regime. I'm just curious.
The short answer is yes, but we've talked about before my approach to sort of bodyweight style training and interval based approaches that way. So I guess the short answer is, yeah, I'm always interested in trying different things, and then you sort of settle on what you think works for you and what you prefer, and what's probably the best way for you to spend the time that you have available to maximize, your own personal health.
Yeah. Just because the reason I asked that is because I wasn't sure if, because I think for those of us that have been doing high intensity strength training for some time, you can really exhaust yourself, in terms of your cardiorespiratory fitness, and it can feel, there's a common sort of word that's thrown around is carpet time. At the end of a high intensity strength training regime, it's not uncommon for someone to be lying on the floor, gasping for air, especially if they've not had much rest between exercises. Not to say that that's a required outcome, for improving cardiovascular fitness, but it's just something that I associate with that. And so I guess what I'm saying is, like, for me, and it seemed like there is sufficient research to show that there's an improvement. I'm just not sure, and maybe I'm missing something, and I know perhaps you may have even asked this on the first one, but it's a lack of my knowledge perhaps. But if we know that high intensity strength training already improves cardiovascular fitness, then if we then include high intensity interval training onto that, is that then falling into that diminishing return that you mentioned at the start of this, that maybe we're not going to get much greater benefit from throwing that into the regime, if any benefit at all?
Well, I guess when you're talking about how these compare, or what the right answer is, if you will, there's the right answer scientifically. And I think, while I don't think anyone would argue that these type of approaches can absolutely increase cardiorespiratory fitness, I think the key question is, do they optimize cardiorespiratory fitness? And, the reality is we don't have the answer to that. And so we can definitely cite single studies. We can definitely cite systematic reviews showing that all of these things improve with that type of approach. And I'm certainly not going to argue that at all, nor am I going to sit here and say, if someone wants to train exclusively that way, good on them. You know what I mean? I think it's going a long way towards getting many of the benefits that we want to associate with fitness. So I think the question becomes, are we arguing scientifically? And I think then the answer is, we really don't know, because we don't have let's say this was a drug trial. So let's say we're not arguing about a type of exercise. You're going to argue that, this new type of blood pressure medication is much better than the traditional approach that's recommended on the drug market right now. And then if you were to bring that drug to market, you would need large scale, randomized, controlled trials, done in a very rigorous manner, in large numbers of individuals. And that's, where all of this sort of falls down a little bit because the scientific studies tend to look at things in isolation, and they haven't compared high intensity resistance exercise versus high intensity interval training versus traditional approaches. And so, we can sort of debate this, I guess, for a long time. And the answer scientifically, we don't have. For individual preferences, or like I say, I'm one of the biggest things with exercise is people need to be motivated to do what they're doing in order to sustain it over the long term. And they have to see and feel that it's working for them. And so to sit there and say, well, you may want to change your program because science says this. As I say, I think you can go a long way with high intensity resistance exercise, boost cardiorespiratory fitness, certainly boost strength and power, and many of the parameters that individuals are looking for, especially in a time efficient approach. It can be an excellent way to train, and I'm not going to deny that or try and argue that point at all.
Yeah, that's a good point you come onto there about preference. And I know that, I think it's perhaps some of your colleagues that maybe head up, that would lead the kind of research around the psychological aspects, but I know they would often collaborate with you if they needed help with that. So I'm just curious, is there do you know of any further research on preferences? Because to your point there, high intensity strength training is really, really hard. And I'm not saying high intensity interval training isn't. In fact, I have to be careful not to be biased here because it's been a very, very long time since I did a sprint interval training or high intensity interval training modality. So it's easy for me to say, high intensity strength training is harder, but they're both very hard in different ways. And then also, some people just don't enjoy steady state because it's almost like you're suffering for a longer period of time, whereas at least the other modes are shorter, right? So is there any more research that's come out recently on preferences for these types of activities? Because as you were saying last time, there's such a small percentage of people that even bloody exercise, that we need to find approaches that, that are going to be easier for people to actually adhere to. So have you got any further thoughts on that at this time?
There's definitely new studies coming out all the time looking at the psychological side of things and the behavioral responses. Much like what we were talking about before, I think it really depends on the individual. And so certainly right now you can look at studies that say people prefer and enjoy a more intense interval-based approach to fitness. And there's people that don't like it as much. And so again, it goes back to this idea of varied approaches, broadly speaking, probably being best. I think the traditional school of thought is, and we would have talked about this last time, is that people are unwilling to do intense interval exercise because it hurts. And that's where I think there's been a sea change of opinion, that we can't just discount potential for interval training to be effective from a public health standpoint by saying no one will do it because it's uncomfortable and it hurts. Clearly, some people don't like to do it, but a number of people will opt to do it, especially if there's time savings. And so that's where a lot of the research is focused, is comparing subjective responses to the more traditional forms of exercise with more cardio-based interval exercise.
This episode is brought to you by our sponsor, ARX. Are you looking to create a cutting-edge, high-intensity training facility? Are you confused on what equipment to use or how to separate yourself from the masses? Well, then ARX Fit might be the answer you're looking for. I asked Mike Polano from ARX a few questions about how ARX machines are challenging the status quo of the exercise industry around the globe. Mike, if you could, give the listeners a quick summary of why ARX is so different from the traditional machines or tools they're used to seeing in most exercise facilities.
ARX is totally different than anything you've seen before. This isn't just another weight stack machine. We've looked at the last 40 years of exercise technology and used that knowledge to create something entirely new. ARX uses a new form of resistance, a motor, and we pair that motor with computer software so that we can maximize the safety, effectiveness, and efficiency of your workouts. So you may be asking, okay, but how does ARX compare to weights? Traditional machines you see in gyms today are based on lifting metal weights and battling gravity. What people don't realize is that when you're forced to lift a static weight like this, one that doesn't adapt or change while you use it, you're underloading yourself rep after rep. And this unnecessarily limits your ability to make improvements. With ARX, we've taken a totally different approach. We removed weights and gravity from the equation altogether. Instead, ARX combines our patented motorized resistance with our custom computer software to provide you with the world's safest, most effective, and most quantified form of resistance training ever. When you train with ARX, you are training to your perfect level of resistance, both positively and negatively 100% of the time. No more guessing what weight to use. ARX does all of that for you, instantly and automatically. We'll also track and measure every second of every rep, so you can quantify all of your workouts to find out if you're improving and by exactly how much. Whether your goals are bigger muscles, increased strength, stronger bones, or just to look good in a bathing suit, ARX can help you achieve all of these and more, but do so in a fraction of the time it would take compared to traditional equipment. If you're looking for the most efficient, most effective, and most quantified piece of exercise equipment on the market today, then look no further than ARX.
Thanks, Mike. That all sounds really impressive. If you'd like to learn more about ARX, visit arxfit.com and mention that you heard about ARX on the Corporate Warrior podcast to receive an exclusive deal of $500 off shipping and installation off your ARX machines. How long, if you've built up your VO2 max from, I guess it could be through strength training or through high intensity interval training or any of these exercise methods. How long does it then take for it to detrain, decondition?
Generally speaking, you can probably lose it in about the same time that you have accrued it. But number one, the time course for accruing it and losing it is different. And I don't love the term muscle memory, but there's still that sort of idea of a muscle memory where probably then if you started to train again, getting it back may be a little bit better. There's not a ton of research on training and detraining effects. We have done a little bit. And so, for example, let's say you were to, whatever your baseline level is, you do 6 weeks of training and you might improve your VO2 max by 12%. If you then completely stopped and detrained, you may not necessarily lose all of that 12%. And so some markers that we've looked at after 6 weeks of detraining, they're certainly lower than after the 6 weeks of training, but they're not necessarily totally back to your starting baseline level. And that's where there's a little bit of evidence for this, again, body memory, muscle memory effect, that you don't completely lose it. But you come back close to baseline for sure if you completely stop training.
Yeah, it's interesting because we know muscle mass sticks around quite a while. When you build muscle, I've read somewhere that it takes around 3 weeks, I think, for in most. Obviously, there's a lot of individual variability, but it takes about 3 weeks for muscle to start to decondition, from what I understand. But from what you're saying there, it sounds like VO2 max starts to decline sooner, and I've heard that before as well. And I've noticed that actually, like for instance, I play basketball, right, once a week. And if I skip just 2 sessions, so let's say I've had 1 session, then I skip 2, so that's 3 weeks later, I really notice the difference in my own fitness. And I guess that's partly due to the skill adaptation as well, right? Your muscle becoming more, and your cardiorespiratory system becoming more adapted to that specific activity. So is that, I guess that's related to this in that.
I may have a sense, and I guess, cardiorespiratory fitness or VO2 max, it's an important element for a lot of sports and activities, but it's not the only one. And its relative importance can vary even in sports that value it. I'll give you a very specific example. So, I play ice hockey every Friday with a group of individuals, and that's short, hard bursts of exercise. We have one fella that we play with who's very, very fit. He's an excellent hockey player, and so presumably his VO2 max is quite high. But then he went and did a week of skiing, of cross-country skiing, which also that activity is rewarded by a high VO2 max. But he got his butt kicked all over the hill. And it's because obviously the elements that go in to make you an excellent ice hockey player are different than the precise elements that make you a good cross-country skier, although VO2 max plays an important role in both. And so I think, coming back to some of our earlier discussions, it also depends on what are you training for? What are you hoping to optimize? Is it a particular event, or are you a first responder and you want a high VO2 max to help support you in your role as a first responder? So it is, at the end of the day, also event specific in terms of what's the physiological basis you're trying to develop for certain events, or is it just overall health?
Absolutely, yeah. No, that's interesting to hear. I'm just curious, how much of VO2 max is genetic? Because I hear a lot that, depending on your genetic predisposition, that some people just have really high VO2 max. And, I just wonder how much of it is genetically set and how much can you actually improve that by?
Yeah, I like to use sort of the 50-50 analogy, but even that, so let's say 50% is heritable or genetic, quote unquote, and let's say the other half is trainable. But the extent that it's trainable also varies, right? So in some individuals, trainable means they can improve it by 20%. In other individuals means they could train it and get it could be 100% improvement. So even when we try to roughly guesstimate what is trainable and what's not, the degree to which it's trainable is also hugely variable. And, so one of the largest training-induced improvement in VO2 max on average is close to 50%. It's a study done in the late 1970s. And these individuals were doing a ton of exercise. And so the average improvement was around 44%. But individual improvement in VO2 max ranged from almost nothing to upwards of 100%. And so again, it speaks to that idea you're only dealing with the trainable aspect, but even in response to a defined exercise program, there's tremendous inter-individual variability. So I think the take-home message is some people, if they have a large trainable aspect, can overcome a genetic predisposition to have a low starting VO2 max, whereas other individuals, their trainability is not great, but maybe they're genetically blessed with having a high one to start with. And of course, the elite endurance athletes benefit from both. They have a high genetic predisposition and they have a huge trainability response. And that's why they have the highest VO2 maxes out there. What you don't want to be, and again, you can't really control this, is someone who has a low genetic predisposition and a very low trainability. But we know those, unfortunately, there's folks out there who suffer from this.
I was going to say door number 4 is not a good one. How do we know where we're at? I mean, I guess you'd have to do a VO2 max test, would you? Or
pretty much you do, and even then, we test people in the lab sometimes. They walk in off the street. They're recruited for a study because they're very sedentary and, by all accounts, they haven't done a whole lot. But then they do the test and they have a high VO2 max. And they're just, again, genetic predisposition to have a large heart. It doesn't mean they're a good endurance athlete because while they might have for 30 seconds a very high VO2 max, if you ask them to work close to that value for a long time, they couldn't do that. So their endurance capacity would still be poor, but their starting value is quite good. But the bottom line is there is no real way to predict other than actually doing the test, and that also doesn't then predict what your trainability is going to look like.
Okay. Just going to talking about Wingate tests for a second. you would explain this to me last time we spoke in terms of how they measure VO2 max. And, obviously there is some, and we talked about this again a little bit last time, there's a little bit of controversy around, well, it's a specific test. So, it's not necessarily a fair way, in some people's opinion, to measure someone's cardiorespiratory fitness. Now, could you do, let's say, again, if we were looking at this scientifically and trying to produce studies in the future that compared these different exercise modalities for cardiorespiratory fitness, would it be possible to, how would you go about measuring VO2 max in a resistance training context? Does that even make sense? So could you attach a mask to someone as they were doing like chest press, and you could do that, right? So you could still measure it in that way. Is that right?
Yeah, you could. Yes. So, the short answer is yes, you could. And I think what you'd have to do is use a traditional test to measure VO2 max, and then use some equivalent resistance exercise test and see how close you get to VO2 max. But I would imagine that if you engaged muscle mass, sufficient muscle mass, and you stressed it sufficiently, that you could probably come close or elicit VO2 max. You could devise a test to do that.
Okay, I'm just curious because I wasn't sure if that was even possible. Okay, I've got a few listener questions. Just want to rattle through and make sure that they get some views from you on that. We talked a little bit already about programming. So here's a interesting question. So a listener of mine asked about easy intervals, i.e. incline walking moderately for a few minutes and then walking faster for a few minutes. Does that equal better results versus an equated work in the way of steady state aerobic activity?
Yes. And there's evidence, for example, from older obese individuals with type 2 diabetes who did either steady state walking or interval walking. And these are just, as I call them, gentle hills and valleys. So the continuous group was working at 65% of their maximal heart rate, just walking at a steady state manner. And the interval group would do a few minutes of slightly faster walking. So their heart rate got up to about 70%, and then they'd back off. So it went down to about 60%. The groups were equated in terms of the average intensity, total time duration. But at the end of a couple of months of training, the interval walkers, their improvement in VO2 max, cardiorespiratory fitness, was better than in the continuous walkers. They also lost a bit more body fat, so their body composition was a little bit better, and their improvement in insulin sensitivity was better as well. So I think it speaks to the fact that even slightly varying the pace of exercise can be beneficial, and it's probably a little bit better for you, generally speaking, than just doing the same continuous steady state pace.
That's interesting. So the fat loss element, do you think that's got something to do with the insulin sensitivity?
You can hand wave around some of these things, or some people would point at fluctuating hormone levels or catecholamines and things like that. Not exactly sure. And generally speaking, you don't see massive weight loss in any of these exercise trials, but you can see some slight but significant shifts in body composition where the lean mass is a little bit better with the interval trainers compared to the steady state exercise. But I don't think we know exactly why that is. But maybe some circulating hormones there might play a slight role.
Have you got a view on why the walking group why they got better results? Is that it's a black box or?
No, it's not a black box. And certainly, put it this way, there's some evidence even at the molecular mechanistic standpoint for why that approach might be more beneficial. And if you can imagine, it's, let's say, regular steady state exercise. You're starting out from some resting level, and then you go up to a new higher level, and then it's maintained. There's only one rest to work transition, or the disturbance to your body's homeostasis only really happens once at the beginning. And then you get to this new steady state level and you stick there. There's a school of thought that would suggest that the more perturbations, the better. So changing it up results in these slight metabolic fluctuations. So slightly higher bursts of calcium and your ATP levels dip a little bit more, and maybe your lactate and your hydrogens are disturbed a little bit more. But all of these molecular markers, these molecular fuel gauges that sense how the body is doing, are disturbed more often. And so even those slight disturbances can add up over time and produce a greater metabolic effect at the end of the training period. And there have been studies, biopsy studies, where they've looked at people doing steady state exercise or these fluctuations, interval-based exercise, even though the total exercise dose is otherwise matched. And the activation of some of these molecular sensors are greater with the interval-based approach. So you'd suggest that that effect sort of adds up over time and leads to the greater adaptive response.
It makes me think, like, if you look at this through like an evolutionary lens and you think maybe it mimics the behaviors of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, maybe in the, you know, the kind of unpredictability of daily routines and, I don't know, like different types of intensities, you know, steady state through to kind of high intensity, and it being kind of a bit all over the place.
Sorry, I was just going to say, that's fascinating to sort of take that perspective. And I think it's really interesting. The one thing, though, that doesn't sort of apply right now, because you think back, using that analogy, what individuals or organisms, the trade-off they had to make was, is the energy I'm going to expend in trying to trace down that prey worth the investment? So if I lose, if I am not able to catch the prey, I've expended a certain amount of energy and I'm not going to be that well off the next time I have to do that. So they're constantly making these intrinsic trade-offs, if you will, in, is the energy that I'll have to expend to try and catch the food worth the investment, or do I sort of sit this one out? We don't struggle with that these days because we're not chasing our prey down, and we can just walk to the corner store and pick up as much energy as we want. So that's the only difference, where the stakes, if you will, in the old days were much, much higher, because if you didn't catch the prey and then you starved to death, or you were left with less energy and then it just became a downward spiral because someone else was catching the food and you weren't, the stakes were a little bit higher.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's what makes it interesting. It's very interesting, right? Because exercise wasn't a thing back then. It was just a way of life. It was just a necessity, an essential part of survival. Whereas today it's, it shouldn't be optional. Well, it certainly isn't optional, obviously, for if you want to have a healthy lifestyle and live a long, healthy life. But it's because it's not so essential day to day in terms of survival. It's you have to actually be a bit more, plan for it and do it. So
no, agreed. And I know we've focused a lot on cardiorespiratory fitness or VO2 max, which is really just one element. But obviously, being strong, being powerful, those are important things as well. And I think that's where making the case clearly for high intensity resistance exercise, it's a tremendous overall conditioning tool because it's building a lot of important elements aside from just VO2 max.
Yeah. Okay, so final question for you before we wrap up. This is I couldn't condense this one anymore because it's a good question, but it's quite a long one. So bear with me on this one, mine. So the question is, I have trouble understanding the balance should be between different kinds of cardio, so high intensity interval training versus steady state, to get the most desirable mix of these outcomes from a health and longevity perspective. To be specific, intervals seem to be ideal for improving VO2 max if you use long enough intervals at high enough intensity, whereas low intensity steady state cardio seems better suited to produce eccentric left ventricle hypertrophy and improved arterial compliance. And there's some studies there from Benjamin Levine. We talked about this a bit already, actually, so maybe there's not much more to add to this. But do you have any perspective on that? And how much should this person be worried about the mix of high-intensity interval training versus steady state? I mean, maybe it's worth giving a kind of a very high-level program from your point of view as to what would be.
Well, I think the question touches on some of the things that we discussed earlier, and that's that we definitely know more from a mechanistic perspective, and in particular, the structural and functional changes to the heart after more traditional steady state exercise. It's just been much, much more well studied. And that's why right now we can't say, well, if you do interval exercise training, you're going to see these same structural and functional changes in the heart. Clearly, the fact that VO2 max goes up and can go up similarly would suggest that some of the same changes occur. But as I said earlier, some of the improvement in VO2 max may be more related to a muscle extraction standpoint. So I guess the question is important and it's relevant because we just can't say the same cardiovascular changes are taking place. I would then come back to, generally speaking, and not necessarily your most dialed in listeners or the people who already have a very specific approach to fitness that they believe in and find works for them. Speaking more generally, I think it also is why a varied approach is going to be best over the long term, because there may be specific adaptations with specific types of training, especially for specific individuals, that are important and that you don't want to miss out on. And so I think for that individual who clearly feels that an element of steady state cardio is important, or they wouldn't want to miss out on something, then including in their program should obviously be important for that individual. But I would use myself. I don't do much steady state cardio myself unless it's walking the dog. And that's just because I don't find it particularly efficient way to train. I have no problem doing interval training a lot, and that's what works for me. So if there's a message I think to leave your listeners with, it's still, I think there's value in this varied approach to fitness, especially if you're someone who's not already on a program that you believe works for you, you really like it. If you're a little more skeptical about some of the adaptations, then taking that varied approach to investing, in this case, investing for exercise in your health, probably makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there's much downside in doing a varied approach. And I guess you have to look at your own response. And if you don't enjoy it, or you have any sort of pain or reason why you would stop doing any protocol, and that could include, some type of strength training that might not be best for you. So it really is looking at it from an individual preference point of view. Now, Martin, I just want to get your perspective on my own regime quickly. Because like you, I have a dog, which I walk on a daily basis, once or twice. She's sitting there fast asleep on the sofa right now. And that is my steady state, like you were saying just then, right? And then I play basketball once a week, which I kind of liken to high intensity intervals, because it's like a little bit of jogging, then some explosive sprinting, jumping, but it's quite, it is a mixture of intensity there. And then obviously I do my strength training at the moment around once a week, full body. So I don't know whether I know I would always be moving. So, I know I would always be making sure I'm walking half an hour a day minimum, regardless. But if I weren't playing basketball, I don't know if I would squeeze in a high intensity interval training session at this time. But it just so happens that I have that mix. So do you feel like that is a sensible amount of exercise? Would you say, oh, hang on, Lawrence, that's one high intensity interval training, if you want to call it that, strength training. So that's 2 workouts a week. Maybe you should be doing more high intensity interval training, or, again, health span being the
yeah, again, I don't want to hedge, but I'm often asked, if you could only do 3 workouts a week, what would you recommend? And I say, again, generally speaking, I would recommend some sort of whole body resistance exercise workout, an interval based workout, and a more traditional steady state workout. And so you could be making the case that you're getting all 3 of those in with the walk of the dog, the basketball, and the high resistance session. Generally speaking, a little bit more is never a bad thing. But how do you feel it's working for you? Right? Are you?
Not bad. I have another issue right now, which is just waking up feeling not as, shall we say, excited recently, and but I think that's probably more diet / looking at screens too late at night related. So I'm working on that. It's probably got nothing to do with my fitness, but yeah, I mean, everything else I'm very happy with: body composition, general health, things like that. So,
maybe just to end it, the Olympic champions or the world record holders in every event, we still don't really know. Are they world champion, or is the world record what it is because of the training or in spite of the training? And so if you were to slightly tweak it, would the world record be a little lower or would it be a little bit worse? And so all of us at the end of the day are experiments of one. Why we do what Olympic athletes do is generally it's worked for them. And clearly it might not be a bad recipe to follow. But even when it comes to our own health, if we were doing something a little bit different, would we be better off? And I think we're constantly making those assessments. Again, it speaks to why bearing it up periodically is probably not a bad strategy to just hit the body in a little different way to keep us off balance a little bit, if you will.
Yeah, you remind me. It's whenever I hear an interview with an incredible high-level athlete and their training coach, and I just think to myself, in almost all cases, I think, and this is going to sound really harsh, but it's just what I believe. I think the coach is successful regardless of what they're saying or making the athlete do, as a very blankety statement, because I'm sure there are some good coaches out there. But, I've heard interviews where you've had the elite athlete and the coach, and you hear the coach speak, and I think I'm not confident in their ability. And if you gave me that athlete, I'm pretty sure I'd also get quite good outcomes, even though that's not my expertise. So I know, to your point, I think that's a very valid point. I think we overestimate how much is achieved from hard work, because we celebrate hard work so much. And I'm not taking away from these athletes, because I know they do work incredibly hard, but we can't forget the kind of God-given gifts that a lot of them have as well, which I think are understated.
No, of course. And just to be clear, because, I have obviously friends and colleagues working in this space. And I think, the best coaches, of course, coaching is a blend of art and science. And the criticism back to the scientists who are often working in silos or, working in the ivory tower, if you will, the elite coaches can very justifiably come back and say, yeah, that might work in theory, or that might work in the laboratory. But in the real world, where you're dealing with all of these other factors, not the least of which is the psychological factors or the specifics around a given competition, even the cultural influences, all of that, there's a lot of things that go into it. But to your point, I had a former student who worked with one of our Olympic teams, and he would sometimes say, I'm not sure if we're winning gold medals because of our training or in spite of our training. And his concern was the potential overtraining of the athletes, and this more and more. And so he said, I think some of them just survive. And maybe that gives them some mental advantage as well. But I think your point is relevant, and it's not always about just doing more. And we still have a lot to learn about the ideal programs to optimize performance for given individuals.
I appreciate that, Martin, and conscious of time, so we'll certainly wrap up there. But look, I just wanted to say, really appreciate you, and as I was saying before this, I appreciate you coming into the lion's den, so to speak, because obviously there is a bias towards kind of high intensity strength training, and although I did say there is a cohort of my listenership who do strength training but also do these other modalities, which is why I'm interested in talking about these things. But I think it takes an enormous amount of courage to do this. I know that you're obviously, I'm sure you're not, worried in any way, because I'm sure you're very used to these types of being challenged, is what I'm trying to say. So.
Yeah, well, certainly, I really appreciate the opportunity. And as I said, I think it's really important for the scientists too to get a sense of what's really working for people, right? And this whole idea of translating it and understanding what like I say, what works for people is important. And I think the bottom line, it's no one size fits all approach for everybody, right? It's
Yeah, so it's simple heuristic to remember it by. I think especially myself included, a lot of my listeners, we get so obsessed with the hair splitting. You could tell one of those questions I asked you around the ventricle of the heart and some other things, that was from, I know, a listener of mine who's just, and that's fine. Like, that's cool that they're obsessed with understanding and learning more, and that's great. And I'm like that. But the kind of the point where it starts to really make you anxious about what you're doing, that's where it's can be quite destructive, right? So it's good to be able to come back to a very simple, high level view of, right, just do a little bit of everything, maybe, and perhaps you're going to tickle the boxes that way. For sure.
Yeah, and for us, regrettably, 80-85% of the folks aren't listening to almost anything we're telling them. And so we keep coming back to this idea of a movement menu, right? Just giving people more options to choose from. And ideally, those options are grounded in good science. That's really what it's about, I think, at the broader public health perspective. And the more options that we can give people, the more menu choices, the better. And then folks can pick what works for them.
Cool. And to everyone, before I do that, Martin, what's the best way for the listeners to find out more about you?
Sure. Probably the best is go to my website, which is just martingibala.com. I have information up there on all of our research. I put all of my podcasts or media stuff up there as well. And I'm on Twitter at Gibala M, although I'm not a super frequent tweeter, certainly compared to some of my colleagues like the illustrious Dr. Phillips.
Right. Don't you have a larger following than Dr. Phillips, though?
No, certainly not there. But I think probably the tweet to follower ratio isn't bad. So that's what I'm aiming for.
Cool. And so Stuart Phillips hasn't convinced you that strength training is superior yet?
Not to get off on a final tangent, but we're actually working together on something called a MOOC, a massive open online course, which will be a course that's freely available on the internet to anyone. And part of the MOOC is looking at what's better for you, cardio or strength training. And so we examine that topic in a fair bit of detail and consider the scientific evidence. But each episode is only about 5 minutes long. And so these are short, digestible bits that, again, are going to be freely available to anyone who might care to watch.
What's the website for that? Sorry.
So we'll definitely will be tweeting it out, but okay. It's going to be called Hacking Exercise for Health. And we expect that it will be released later in the spring. The platform is called Coursera, but certainly watch my website, or if you follow Dr. Phillips or myself on Twitter, we'll definitely be making people aware when that is finally released.
That's great. That sounds really, really interesting. Awesome. Okay, cool. So for everyone listening, to find the blog post for this one, please go to corporatewarrior.co/Gibala, Gibala 2, number 2. And for all episodes, please go to corporatewarrior.co/podcast. And until next time, thank you very much for listening.
Discover how to improve health, become a great personal trainer, and build a successful high-intensity strength training business. Check out corporatewarrior.co. corporatewarrior.co.
This episode is brought to you by ARX, the most innovative, efficient, and effective all-in-one exercise machines I have ever seen. I was really impressed with my ARX workout. The intensity and adaptive resistance was unlike anything I've ever experienced. I love how the machine enables you to increase the negative load to fatigue target muscles more quickly, and I love how the workouts are effortlessly quantified. The software tracks maximum force output, rate of work, total amount of work done, and more in front of you on screen, allowing you to compete with your previous performance to give you and your clients real-time motivation. The ARX uses a computer-controlled motor to give you the exact amount of resistance your clients need 100% of the time. This means that the resistance can never become dangerous, is intuitive and simple to use, and can provide you with all of the results you and your clients are looking for in a fraction of the time. ARX is highly effective and efficient in delivering all of the benefits of exercise, including increased strength, muscle mass, cardiovascular conditioning, bone mineral density, and injury recovery. As well as being utilized by many high-intensity trainers to deliver highly effective and efficient workouts to their clients, ARX comes highly recommended by world-class trainers and brands, including Bulletproof, Tony Robbins, and Ben Greenfield Fitness. To To find out more about ARX and get $500 off install when you place an order, please go to arxfit.com and mention Corporate Warrior in the How Did You Hear About Us field. So again, to get $500 off install when you order, head on over to arxfit.com and enter Corporate Warrior in the How Did You Hear About Us field.